All right, let's get into section 3 of this PowerPoint. If you recall, going back to the last PowerPoint, remember we talked about the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson being sworn into office. Let's kind of get into more about Lyndon B. Johnson, who he was, and then some of his accomplishments and things he was able to get done while president. So LBJ is a fourth-generation Texan who will enter politics in 1937 as a congressman. One of his biggest role models while growing up was Franklin D. Roosevelt, who took the young congressman under his wing and will teach LBJ quite a bit. Uh, Johnson will become a senator in 1948, and by 1955, he was a Senate Majority Leader. So, again, you can already see him rising throughout the ranks in this short period of time. Now, as soon as he'll take office, he urges Congress to pass a tax cut bill that Kennedy had sent to Capitol Hill. He wanted to make sure that that was able to still get passed, and it was passed, and $10 billion in cuts took effect. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, in July of 64, LBJ will push this act through Congress. And this act is important because it will prohibit discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin, and will grant the federal government new powers to enforce the law. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. has been trying to get this passed for quite some time, and honestly, it took even a lot for him to convince LBJ to get this bill passed. But long story short, it will be passed in 1964, and we'll talk a lot more about this act when we get to our whole civil rights unit. Now, the Voting Rights Act of 1964 is also incredibly important because part of the Civil Rights Act was to ensure that voting rights for all Americans, that everybody could vote. And one thing that some people had to do, especially Southerners, especially black Southerners, had to do is they had to sometimes pass what was known as a literacy test. And these literacy tests were utterly ludicrous, the things that you had to try to do. It really didn't test you if you could read it all. Some of it did, but a lot of it was just incredibly asinine what these people had to try to figure out and pass on this test in order to be able to vote. Doesn't matter if you were the best reader in the world. It might be a little ridiculous for you to answer some of these questions. And I have an actual literacy test that I'll try to put on Google Classroom for you, for those of you that are doing the online learning, that we'll definitely go through in class. But I want you to try to do that, and you can only do it in a certain amount of time, and then you have to get every single question right. If you get one question wrong, you are not given the right to vote. And the other thing is, too, is what you would have to do is you would have to go down basically to your local courthouse or whatever. You would take this test, and the judge was, more often than not, a white person, and there was no key. They would go through and decide if they wanted you to vote or not, and a lot of times they would just say you got a question or two wrong, and therefore you couldn't vote. So again, the whole idea of the literacy test was to prevent black Southerners especially from voting. So this Civil Rights Act is going to get rid of this idea of literacy tests. So I strongly recommend that you do the one that I put on Google Classroom just so you can kind of get a taste of what these people had to go through, what people had to go through in the South. Now, the act will ensure consistent election practices, and that's the main goal, making sure that everyone has the same right to be able to vote. Now, following his tax cut and the Civil Rights Act success, LBJ will launch his war on poverty. And in August of 1964, he will push through Congress a series of measures known as the Economic Opportunity Act, or EOA. The act will provide $1 billion in aid to the inner city. The EOA will also help create Job Corps. Okay, Job Corps are basically it's a free education almost, where there'd be different types of trainings that you can get for different types of jobs for people that are age 16 through I believe 24. 16 to 24, it's free training. And that's still going on today. You also had VISTA, which is Volunteers in Service to America. Project Head Start for underprivileged preschoolers, which is still going on strong today as well. And then the Community Action Program, which encouraged the poor to participate in public works program, getting people back to work. Now, the 1964 election. So remember, LBJ will take over, after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So this is the first election that LBJ will actually have to win, to now remain president. So in 1964, the Republicans will nominate conservative Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona to oppose Democrat Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, Goldwater will oppose LBJ's social legislation, and honestly, he'll oppose any and everything that LBJ either did or was trying to accomplish. Now, Goldwater alienated voters by suggesting the use of nuclear weapons in Cuba and in North Vietnam. Goldwater was seen as a radical option as well. And just going off this statement right here, you can kind of predict on who's going to win the election, and it's not going to be Goldwater. So LBJ will win the 1964 election, and honestly, it's not even close. For a lot of people, even if you didn't care for LBJ, it was mainly just an anti-Goldwater vote to make sure that he did not get the presidency. Democrats also will increase their majority in Congress, and what this allows LBJ to do is going to allow him to pass even more acts that he wants to accomplish. So here you can see the map of the election of 1964. The yellow are the states that LBJ won, whereas the blue are the ones that Goldwater won. He had 486 electoral votes to Goldwater's 52. So again, not even close compared to the 1960 election, which was one of the closest in U.S. history. Now, in May of 1964, LBJ will sum up his vision for America, and he'll use the phrase the Great Society. By the time he'll leave the White House in 1969, Congress had passed 206 of LBJ's Great Society legislative initiatives. So, getting quite a bit done that he wanted to accomplish while in office. And one of those main things he also wanted to impact was education. Johnson considered education the key, which can unlock the door to the Great Society. In other words, you need to have an educated society. So the Elementary and Secondary Education Act will provide $1 billion to help public schools buy textbooks and library materials. And believe it or not, this is the first time that we've seen a major federal aid package for education ever in the country's history. Okay, it's embarrassing that it took that long, but finally, one will be passed. Also, healthcare. LBJ and Congress will enhance Social Security by establishing Medicare and Medicaid. Provides hospital insurance at low cost for medical care to the elderly. And then Medicaid will provide health benefits to the poor. For the exam, whenever we get there, make sure you know the difference between Medicare and Medicaid because you'll definitely see that on the test. Now, for housing, LBJ and Congress will appropriate money to build 240,000 units of low rent public housing, and he will establish the Department of Housing and Urban Development, also known as HUD, which is obviously still around here today. He'll also appoint the first black cabinet member, Robert Weaver, as HUD's first leader. Now, the Great Society will also bring reform to immigration laws. The Natural Origins Acts of the 1920s strongly discriminated against immigration by those outside of Western Europe. So, in other words, what the act was trying to do was just get immigrants from Western Europe, anybody else, whether it be from Eastern Europe, whether it be from Latin America, whether it be from Africa, wherever. It would be more difficult for you to get inside the country. Now, the Immigration Act of 1965 will open the door for many non-European immigrants to come and settle into the United States. LBJ will also actively seek to improve the environment. The Water Quality Act of 1965 will require states to clean up their rivers and lakes. LBJ will also order the government to clean up corporate polluters of the environment as well, especially those in factories. They have consumer protection. Consumer advocates also made gains during the 1960s, whereas major safety laws were passed in the U.S. auto industry, and Congress passed the Wholesome Meat Act of 1967 as well. LBJ stated Americans can feel safer now in their homes, on the road, and at the supermarket with this idea of consumer protection. Now, his changes were not limited to the executive and legislative branch. The judicial branch, led by the Supreme Court and Chief Justice Earl Warren, did much to protect individual rights as well, with things such as you can see 1961. Now, this was prior to LBJ taking over. This was still during the Kennedy presidency, but the Supreme Court ruled that legally seized evidence could not be used in court. In Escobedo versus Illinois, the court ruled that the accused has the right to have an attorney present when questioned by police. And also, this one might be familiar to everyone, that Miranda versus Arizona, the court ruled that all suspects must be read their rights before questioning, which is also known as your Miranda rights. You must be read your Miranda rights before questioning. Now, the Great Society and the Warren Court will change the United States. No president at this point in the World War II era extended their power and reach of the federal government more than LBJ did at this time. The war on poverty will help. The Civil Rights Initiative made a difference in the massive tax cuts will help, kind of spur the economy during his reign. Now, we are going to kind of look at different stations here, some primary sources as well of things that LBJ accomplished. You kind of get more details, whether or not you thought these acts that he had were a good or a bad thing, if they helped the country out, if they hurt the country, kind of get to form your own opinion. So again, check Google Classroom. Make sure you're able to get that activity completed.